Hey everybody, what's up? You know, I've often been asked or I've been told by people, Mike, your teachings of MMT and the explanations, you've opened up my eyes. You've made me really understand how the monetary system works. It's incredible. For all these years, you know, I had it all wrong and backward, and from the stuff you have taught me, it has just given me a new perspective, and for the first time, I understand the truth. But then they follow up like this. They said, Mike, you know, when I learn these things, it becomes so obvious and so, you know, rational that I start to wonder, don't the people out there who are pushing all this false information and this flawed doctrine, don't they really understand? I mean, isn't it kind of like they understand, right? But for whatever reason, they have an agenda. They're hiding their understanding behind whatever that agenda is designed to achieve. And you know, I thought about that for a long time. And I was lucky enough for a period of time when I worked at Fox News, and you know, I was there for over 10 years, and before that I was regular guest host on CNBC's Squawk Box, actually when they started that in the mid-90s, and then before that, when I was living in Switzerland, I used to do a little show in London every once in a while. But anyway, my time at Fox, I got to meet a lot of people, a lot of, you know, important and influential people, and because I worked there, and because probably they had seen me on various shows, you know, they kind of take you into their confidence. You know, like you're one of them, you work at this big network, and they saw you on TV, so these people might be highly placed in government and in positions of policy. They could be CEOs, right? They could be government ministers, whatever, even presidents, and, you know, they take you into their confidence because, hey, Mike, they saw me. Some of them even knew me by my first name. So it gave me a very unique position to kind of speak with these people, you know, in their confidence. And you know what I always say, like you can tell, like if somebody is kind of like putting on a show or something, if somebody's slick, right? If they're hiding their true agenda, if they're good at it, you won't find any inconsistencies in their arguments. I mean, they have that, you know, their scheme is all thought out. And no matter what kind of question or curveball you try to throw them, it's like for them, they have already figured out the chess game and they know the response, and it's very hard to pick them off in terms of inconsistencies. But the ones who are, you know, really not that smart, and you know what I'm talking about, they're all out there, these kooks, you can pick off their inconsistencies all the time. So this is a little story I'm going to tell you about my my run-in with David Stockman. David Stockman, of course, for those of you who don't know who David Stockman is, he was the former budget director under Ronald Reagan, all right, in Reagan's first term. And David Stockman, ultimately, he was fired by President Reagan because he was very adamantly against the deficits that had run up during Reagan's presidency. And by the way, those deficits were what lifted the economy out of a very brutal recession, because the deficit is net spending, right? It's the government spending more than it is taking away from you in taxes. So it leaves the non-government with a net addition of dollars, in the case of the United States, in their financial balances, all right? It's like filling up the swimming pool. Anyway, Stockman, so he got fired, all right? And then he kind of disappeared for like 20 years. Like you didn't hear about David Stockman from the 1980s all the way, I would say, to the early 2000s. And then he started to pop up here and there. And he was still back on that debt, that whole debt kick, and talking about how this is going to be the end. I mean, he's been talking about that now for, his whole entire career, like a lot of these guys. I mean, they literally make little cottage industries for themselves talking about that. People like Jim Rogers, people like Schiff, people like all of them. Like, the world's coming to them. They don't understand the monetary system. But anyway, Stockman reappeared. And he had written a book, I guess it was the mid-2000s. I was still over there on Fox. And, again, the book, what do you think it was about? It was about debt. By the way, just as a side note here, I'm happy to report that David Stockman has kind of segued off of that whole debt bomb thing, at least a little bit, because I see him now writing articles on geopolitics. He just wrote an article recently about the U.S. bomb strikes in Syria, which I thought was a very, very excellent argument, where he criticized that, rightly so. I mean, I think it was a ridiculous thing to do. We have no national interest in Syria whatsoever. The whole thing was fake. That chemical attack, I mean, it was like, and Trump, in his campaign said he wouldn't be doing that. It was crazy to do that. It leads to nothing. It's a waste. And he was absolutely right, and then he flipped. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. I'm just happy to see that Stockman has at least temporarily gotten off the monetary thing, which he doesn't understand. But here's my story about, people asking me, do these people secretly understand what the truth is? Because they're like, Mike, they can't be that dumb, because when I learned it, it became so obvious to me, right? They got to know. So they must be hiding it to pursue or push a certain agenda, right? And here's my story. I'm going to tell you, because I did think about that, and it was always kind of like, like my gut feeling, like they didn't know. They're not that smart, all right? And even if they're smart, like educated-wise, they went to great schools, Ivy League schools, whatever, they're ideologues, right? They have a belief system, and they are rigidly tied to that belief system, and they don't want to let it up. So anyway, I'm at Fox News one day, and who walks in is David Stockman. David Stockman walks in, so we're sitting in the green room, and I get into a conversation with David Stockman, and he's like, he goes right away into it, like, the United States is broke, it's bankrupt, our debt is blowing through the roof, the interest rates are going to spike, the Chinese are not going to lend us money, all this typical storyline. And I'm like, David, it's not about the Chinese. Chinese don't lend us dollars. I mean, we are the issuer of the dollar. We print the dollar, right? I mean, we don't need to borrow what we can create without limit. And I said that, and here was the main point. I said, it's the Federal Reserve that sets the interest rate. It's not the Chinese, it's not the Japanese, it's not the Germans, it's not anybody else. It's the Federal Reserve. That's why we all sit around every month when there's a Fed meeting, at 2 o'clock, waiting for that statement. And he's like, no, you're going to see interest rates are going to spike. The Chinese are not going to lend us money. And, we were going back and forth. It was getting nowhere. It was going nowhere. And then he gets called out into the studio to do his segment. I was still in the green room, and I'm watching the TV, and he goes off on his spiel, the same thing. We're broke, we're bankrupt, interest rates are going to spike, the Chinese are not going to lend us money, the nation is finished, right? The whole thing. He leaves. That for me, that was the end of the story, right? The guy was an ideologue. You're not going to convince him. He believes that rates are set externally by foreigners. Decide some Chinese guy somewhere says, okay, now you got to pay us X amount. Otherwise, we're going to extort you, or you're not going to get your dollars that we got from you, right? So several months go by, and I was going to Fox almost every day to do various shows and segments. Several months goes by, and I'm sitting in the green room once again. And who walks in? David Stockman. He's back to do another segment on Neil Cavuto's show. And so it had been maybe, this was all happening during the time of the financial crisis. I guess it was like 2008, 2009. And the deficit ran way up. It was like 1.5 trillion, right? it was almost like 10% of GDP, or very close. And, on our last conversation, it was really an argument. He was saying the deficit too is going to cause right? He's a big anti-deficit guy. The deficit's going to, and he came back and interest rates were still at zero. And I started talking to him again. I said, David, what happened? The deficit's now, twice as big as what it was the last time you were here. Interest rates were still at zero. And this is what he says to me. And I said, there's no inflation and interest rates are still at zero. And the dollar was very stable. In fact, it was already starting to rise at that time. And this is what he says to me. He said, that's because of the damn Fed. They're keeping interest rates down. And right there, remember what I said about catching somebody in his inconsistency? That shows they're stupid, or that shows they're just dogmatic, right? They have a belief system that they're clinging to, and even though they might be an educated person, they don't want to give that up. So I said, David, last time you were here, you told me the Chinese set the interest rate, that they're not going to lend to us. Now you're saying, it's because of the damn Fed, they're keeping the interest rate too low? Which one is it? And that, he had no response. That shut him up. He was flustered. And that shows you that these people, in answer to the question, and many of you might have this question, Mike, they got to understand. It's so easy to understand once you get it, once you shed that dogma, once you get rid of that false belief, and you open up your mind and yourself to understanding and the knowledge fills you up like light, pushes away the darkness, and then everything is like, ooh, you see everything. It becomes very easy to understand. So naturally, if you're an intelligent person, you think, well, these guys got to understand it, right? They went to Harvard, they went to Princeton, they went to Yale, they went to Penn. They got to understand it. They don't understand it. They don't understand it. And you catch them every single time in their inconsistencies. And that's one story. I got a lot of these stories, folks. Maybe I'll start doing it. See ya.